Hello and welcome to another interview. This time you'll be talking with Dr. Adam Carter. Could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi Brandon. So I'm Adam Carter. I'm a assistant professor in the Department of Plant Sciences at the University of Saskatchewan, and I'm a spring wheat and canary seed breeder in the Crop Development Center here. So I'm happy to talk to you today, Brandon, and hope I can answer some questions for you.
Thank you. So what are some common features you're looking for in new wheat cultivars when you're breeding them?
So common features. So the reality is with a lot of major crops, a new variety has to have a pretty solid package, including things like improved agronomics, so higher yielding typically, as well as a strong disease resistance package, and that can vary depending on crop type. And then the quality profile is, especially in the wheat world, is incredibly important. So the main market class that I breed for in wheat is called Canada Western Red Spring. It's abbreviated as CWRS. It has really high standards for quality, and that's a really important target for our breeding program is to satisfy those requirements and to meet the end use market needs for a class like CWRS. So there's a lot of features. Because of that, we have to address agronomics, disease resistance, and quality to register and release a new wheat cultivar.
Since that goes into other topics, how do you breed for stem rust and fusarium resistance?
Yeah, so on the disease resistance side, stem rust and fusarium head blight resistance are two of our what we consider priority one diseases to breed resistance for in wheat in Western Canada. Others are leaf rust, stripe rust, and common bunt. But for stem rust and leaf rust in particular, we grow disease nurseries. That is the best way to breed for disease resistance is to expose your breeding populations to that pathogen and see how they respond. So here in Saskatoon, we have a relatively large stem rust and leaf rust nursery where we evaluate tens of thousands of early generation breeding lines every year. Advanced lines we hand off to our pathology colleague, Dr. Randy Kuchar, who does more extensive rating and assessment of true rust resistance in those lines. But we expose a lot of our material to pathogens to try and select for resistance relatively early in our program. The same is true with Fusarium head blights. Recently, in 2024, we started a new early generation Fusarium head blight nursery in Saskatoon, where we greatly increased our capacity to screen our breeding populations. So with certain pathogens, certain diseases like stem rust, resistance is pretty. We have pretty good sources of resistance uh, to stem rust and leaf rust. Fusarium head blight is still one of the most challenging pathogens to breed resistance for in wheat. It's very quantitative in nature, the resistance, and it's difficult to phenotype accurately. So a lot of our effort is recently has been going into improving Fusarium head blight resistance. But the answer to that question is really expose your populations to the pathogens and see how they respond.
Also heard that you're tinkering with spelt. How are you improving the genetics of this older line of wheat, and are you using it to incorporate new traits that are novel into regular bred wheat?
Oh, interesting question. So yeah, my predecessor, Dr. Pierre Huckel, has been working with spelt for many years now and has a small spelt sweet breeding program that has generated some and released some varieties through the Crop Development Center. In terms of improving the genetics, it's classical plant breeding that's being applied just to that particular type of wheat. But the main targets have been mostly agronomic focused, so looking at especially reducing plant heights, improving lodging tolerance. A lot of spelt wheat lodges very easily. So just improving the agronomics has been a major target in the spelt breeding program here. And yes, you can intercross spelt with common wheats or bred wheats, and we have done that to introduce some traits in the past. So I have a master's student who's working on a black gloom trait. That's where if you look at the spikes at maturity, they actually have really dark pigmentation. Um, and there are many sources of that trait in other wheat species, but us, we brought that in through a particular spelt line. Um, yeah, so it can be done. There's a lot of linkage drag usually associated with, depending on the spelt wheat that you're crossing with, but yeah, it's pretty interesting to play with.
So, what are some of your biggest hits in terms of key discoveries you've made during your time at the wheat program?
That's an interesting question. So, um, key discoveries. I think speaking in plant breeding broadly, this is something I had some intuition coming into this program about, but I've really learned, it's cemented for me that for plant breeding programs, it's really about the structure of the program, the infrastructure, the capacity that you have, and the people that you have, which are all really, I consider, management tasks. We need to, the effort that we put into producing really high quality disease nurseries pays off immensely. And in having good training for our staff, in making sure everyone's engaged in our activities and understands why we're doing certain things. Um, it's not necessarily science, but these are tools that lead to effective plant breeding programs, in my experience. So yeah, that's been one thing over the past 2 years that has really become even clearer to me, the importance of having well-structured, well-managed breeding programs.
Excellent. And building upon that, through this breeding process, you likely found a lot of new different genes and genetic regions of interest like QTLs that are useful for future breeding. Of those, which ones do you think are the most important?
Wow, that's a that's a really difficult question to answer, and certainly there's a lot of work that actually goes on before the core breeding process. Some people call that pre-breeding or germplasm development. We're lucky to have Dr. Valentina Klimiuk, who is recently hired at the University of Saskatchewan, who is our applied genomics and pre-breeder in wheat, supporting bred wheat and durum wheat. And so that's when a lot of this trait discovery in mapping genes, developing markers, a lot of that work happens before we introduce that information into our breeding program. In terms of importance, well, like I said, there's a lot of traits that we're targeting. So, and they're all very important. So it's tough to narrow down a few, but recently we've been working on some stripe rust resistance genes, incorporating those stripe rust resistance genes into our breeding germplasm. That's been in collaboration with Dr. Klimiuk. And I think that's pretty exciting, introducing new disease resistance genes, and continuing to explore potential new traits like the black loom trait that I mentioned. So there's never one most important thing, right? Plant
Yeah,
breeding is all about balancing different traits, and
exactly. I just wanted a sort of greatest hits of ones that stood out to you just as a mode of curiosity. Speaking of curiosity, many of the professors I've talked to had some funny stories that happened, something unexpected showing up in their breeding program. So has anything like that happened?
um, there's always surprises every year. Yeah, populations don't always behave the way that you would expect them to. You can have some interesting outliers. Um, that's a good question. So this isn't my experience, but I think it's an interesting one that my predecessor told me about. Was he was looking at a germplasm accession in a plot in the field, and there was one off type that was really tall, had a massive spike, and large leaves. Looked like a lot of biomass was being produced. And so Dr. Huckle is who I'm referring to here. He collected seed from that single plant, started crossing with it, and ultimately it led to the development of a forage wheat line, which was registered last year called CDC Bandit. So it's one of those stories where you kind of think, okay, we see these off types in the field occasionally, um, and a certain kind of plant breeder can take advantage of that, try something potentially high risk, and have it pay off in the long run.
I also have another question. Since you have these special nurseries for disease, you have nurseries for drought or salt tolerance.
So with biotic stress, like disease nurseries, they're much easier to manage. They're still challenging, but they're much easier to manage than abiotic stress. So for drought tolerance in particular, it's tough to really control that stress. We have some colleagues in our department who do experiments using high tunnels or rainout shelters, so they can actually physically impede the rain from reaching the lines being evaluated. But at scale, that's really difficult to do. And in plant breeding, we are looking for to do things at large scales. So we rely mostly on growing our material in many different environments around Western Canada. And usually, in most years, at least one of those environments will experience some drought or heat stress. And we can use that information to help make selections about um, how our material would perform under particular abiotic stress. So it's not as controlled as our disease nurseries.
Can you think of any ways to refine to make it easier to control?
That's a really good question. Um, do you mean in terms of scaling it
In
up
terms
or?
of making it more controllable, I know that Dr. Karen Tonino is actually has a special greenhouse-like contraption
Yeah.
where you can plant it out and grow it out in very controlled drought environments so you don't get bounced by any unexpected rains, so you can keep
Mhm.
the same knowledge. I'm wondering if you
Yeah.
have something similar to that.
So those are what I was referring to as in rainout shelters or high tunnels. And yeah, they're excellent for evaluating variation for drought tolerance and sometimes heat tolerance. But if have you toured those um, tunnels?
Yes, I have actually. They're
Yeah,
pretty cool.
yeah, they're very cool, and I think really interesting research tools. But you see how much space it can be
Yeah,
or is available within each high tunnel, and it's not that much. You can evaluate maybe several or a dozen or maybe a couple dozen different lines within each tunnel.
and it's going to
Um,
be harder to harvest as well.
yeah, exactly. You can't really get our normal plot equipment in them very easily, and we're not looking to evaluate a few dozen lines. We're looking to evaluate hundreds or thousands of breeding lines. So that's a scale problem. Where I think they do have a lot of potential is in maybe identifying and giving us more information as to how wheat plants respond. Is there genetic variation in their response? Can we potentially identify germplasm, so genetic material that we can use that carries some drought or heat tolerance? So maybe good tools in that before breeding side of things. So identifying useful parents to use in our crossing blocks.
To build upon that a little bit further, I've heard about Kenderdine Research Station. That's in a very drought-prone location. Would that be used extensively as a way to test for drought?
So we don't. We rely a lot on our colleagues in the southern part of Saskatchewan, and sometimes in southern Alberta that more frequently face drought stress, especially terminal drought stress. So towards the end of the growing season. So Swift Currents is a great site usually to evaluate material under terminal drought stress and heat stress. Um, so yeah, that's probably the largest site that we have to evaluate drought tolerance.
Now, bringing it all back to the genetics, many of these traits are quantitatively inherited, but not all quantitatively inherited traits are equal. Some are more easily inherited than others.
Yeah.
Which ones would be the most easily inherited amongst the traits of interest?
Um, Okay, so I mean, traits that are highly heritable tend to be easier to breed for and are usually not the ones that we're as focused on. A lot of the complex quantitative traits that we're interested in, like grain yields, to some extent, like Fusarium head blight resistance, they can be relatively low to mid heritability. Um, And so, but that's why progress has been slower on them, and why it takes a lot more resources to improve them, is to overcome that challenge. But so yeah, I'd say those are two that are, um, especially grain yield is one of the mid heritability traits that we focus on.
Thank you. For the last question before the final question, it's not commonly known what the difference between hard versus soft wheat is, red versus white, and spring versus winter. So could you explain that for the audience?
Sure, yeah. So those are kind of general classes or characterizations of or characters of wheat. So just spring versus winter, that's just in growth habit. So spring wheat, which is most of what's grown in Western Canada, is planted or seeded in the spring and harvested in the fall or in the late summer to the early fall. Winter wheat is seeded in the fall and goes through a vernalization process, and it is harvested usually a bit earlier than spring wheat, but the following summer. So it's seeded before the winter, and grows in the following summer. In terms of kernel characteristics, like soft versus hard, there are some broad differences with this. This really relates to milling characteristics that are typical of hard versus soft wheat. So hard wheat tends to be higher protein and tends to have stronger gluten than soft wheats, and is more used in baking bread and general applications. Soft wheats are more useful for pastries, cookies you can think of, and so they really differ in their end use um, abilities. And in terms of red versus white, this refers to the kernel color. And those really come into play when you're thinking about whole wheat milling applications. Okay, so you can have combinations of both. You can have hard whites, soft whites, wheats, and the choice of what's grown and what's used by millers and processors totally depends on the products that they're aiming to make. And then durum, I should mention durum. So durum isn't classified as soft versus hard like bread wheat is. It's very hard. Durum is very hard, and it has very strong gluten as well. It's just typically not as what we call extensible as bread wheat doughs. So it's very well suited for pasta production in particular.
Thank you. And now that we finish all the questions, there's the last question, it's what I ask for everybody. Could you name one thing about agriculture that most people don't know about, but everybody should be thinking about a lot more?
One thing about agriculture that most people should know, that's maybe not widely known. Um, I think a lot of people don't really know how much um, support goes into modern agriculture practices, and how I think vibrant our agriculture industry is in Western Canada in particular. We have pretty tremendous producer groups in Western Canada that are dedicated to support the production of crops like wheat and in investing in research, in breeding, and in making sure that our crops that are being produced are at that really premium quality level that the global market recognizes. Um, so yeah, I think usually we kind of take that for granted, right? We grow a wheat variety and it's sold and enters the marketplace. But there's a lot of support that is behind the scenes, making sure that our agriculture industry is rich and thriving. So I think people, if you spend any time in agriculture industry, you might know that. But if you're buying a loaf of bread off the shelf of a grocery store, um, there's a lot of details that you just wouldn't know.
Thank you, and that's a good place to end it off. Thank you for watching, and thank you, Dr. Carter, for joining.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. Nice to be here.